Jakarta, 1974. The diplomatic circuit runs on gin, cigarettes, and performance. Viktor stood at the edge of a garden party, Soviet suit, Russian cigarette burning to the filter. To the CIA, he was the most important signals asset in Southeast Asia. To ASIS, he was a man 3 weeks from breaking. The CIA had 40 personnel, armored vehicles, and a direct line to the most sophisticated psychological profiling units in Virginia. ASIS had 1 officer and a social budget that barely covered a decent bottle of scotch. By the time the CIA's machinery was fueled and ready, the asset was already gone. Not disappeared, still at his desk, still attending the same parties, but he no longer belonged to Moscow, and he certainly didn't belong to Washington. 1 officer, 1 balcony conversation, 1 question that ended a 6-month CIA operation before it began. How does a smaller service outrun the most powerful intelligence machine on Earth? And why didn't the CIA see the loss coming until it was already over? What follows is reconstructed from the declassified accounts of the officer who ran the operation. Viktor's official title was mid-level Soviet trade official. That was the cover. Underneath it, he was a KGB officer controlling regional communications and the identities of Soviet illegals operating across Southeast Asia. For the CIA, flipping Viktor meant dismantling a decade of Soviet intelligence infrastructure in the Pacific. For ASIS, it meant something different. Owning the source meant Canberra wasn't a junior partner anymore. They would be the gatekeepers. Intelligence recruitments are diagnosed using a framework called MICE: money, ideology, coercion, and ego. Viktor was a rare case. All 4 were live at the same time. His family back in Moscow survived on state rations while he watched Western diplomats eat imported steak. That was the money. He had watched the Politburo's inner circles calcify into corruption, and the ideology he was sent to defend had stopped making sense years ago. That was the ideology. His Jakarta posting was ending, and a return to Moscow meant a cold desk and a quiet death of a career. That was the coercion. But the deepest pressure, the one that kept him on balconies instead of inside at parties, was that Viktor was one of the sharpest minds in the Soviet diplomatic circuit, and no one in Moscow had noticed in 15 years. That was the ego. The CIA had all 4 indicators flagged in their system. They were analyzing a target. ASIS was watching a man. The CIA's failure in Jakarta was not a failure of effort, it was a failure of mass. To authorize a single approach toward Viktor, the station chief had to justify operational risk in triplicate. Every cable to Langley traveled through a gauntlet of analysts, legal advisors, and deputy directors, each adding another layer of caution. They were terrified of a blown recruitment, a diplomatic incident landing on the White House desk. So they spent months constructing a psychological profile Viktor would never read. They spent weeks debating the opening offer. They spent days coordinating a surveillance perimeter so elaborate it nearly had its own chain of command. Each step was heavier than the last. The machine was moving, but it was moving toward a Monday that was already too late. Warren Reed moved differently. Reed was ASIS's officer on the ground, and he had something the CIA station chief didn't: the authority to act on what he saw in the room. While Langley debated cables, Reed was 5 feet from Viktor at a cocktail party. While the CIA built their surveillance perimeter, Reed was learning which bar Viktor preferred after long diplomatic evenings. He didn't need a risk assessment to tell him when to make contact. He had operational autonomy. And in Jakarta in 1974, that was worth more than 40 personnel and a fleet of armored vehicles. The CIA was a freight train. Reed was a blade. A blade doesn't wait for clearance. The lock-in happened on a Tuesday night. Private dinner in the diplomatic quarter, jasmine in the air, the distant rumble of Jakarta traffic below. Viktor spent the evening performing. He laughed when it was expected, drank with Soviet discipline, played the loyal party servant with the fluency of a man who had been doing it for 20 years. But Reed watched the way Viktor held his glass at the end of a sentence, the half-second where the performance slipped. When Viktor stepped onto the balcony to escape the heat, Reed didn't reach for a script. No backup team, no safe house 3 blocks away, no pre-approved pitch language sitting in a folder. He walked out and stood at the railing. 5 minutes of silence. They watched the city. That silence was the most deliberate move Reed made all evening. It created a space where neither of them had to be what they were in the room behind them. Reed broke it first. He didn't mention Moscow. He didn't mention money. He talked about the room they had just left, the theater of it, the weight of performing a version of yourself for people who don't care who you actually are. He said there was a way to stop. Viktor's knuckles went white against the railing. Reed didn't push. He let the city fill the space. Then he laid out the offer, not the American version, loud and transactional, built for congressional briefings and press conferences. Something quieter, Australian, permanent, something no one would ever hear about. 20 minutes, no signature, no cash, no handshake. Viktor looked at Reed and asked one question quietly. What do I do first? The asset was locked. The CIA's pitch was still sitting in a top-secret folder on a desk 5 miles away. Monday arrived. The CIA moved with textbook precision. Safe house prepared, security detail in position, station chief carrying 6 months of carefully crafted pitch language. They found Viktor cold. Not compromised, cold, disciplined. He met their overtures with the practiced ease of a man who had already made his decision and buried it. The CIA retreated. They went back to the station and spent days combing through surveillance logs, running technical diagnostics, checking for KGB counter-surveillance. They looked at every variable. They never looked at the Australian embassy. For months afterward, high-grade intelligence on Soviet regional operations began flowing into Langley through an Australian channel. CIA analysts praised the Australians for a remarkable streak of luck. They never questioned the source. The source was Viktor, the man they had spent 6 months and hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to recruit, was already running for the agency that beat them with a bottle of scotch and 20 minutes on a balcony. In the intelligence world, every operation runs on an OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. The agency that cycles through that loop fastest owns the operation. The CIA's loop ran through hundreds of people across thousands of miles. It was a freight train, powerful, unstoppable once moving, but incapable of turning when the terrain changed beneath it. ASIS's loop was a single heartbeat, one officer, one decision, one act. The Jakarta recruitment is still studied because it exposes a truth no budget can fix. Intelligence is not a game of who has the most information. It is a game of who has the shortest distance between a thought and an action. The CIA was playing logistics. ASIS was playing human psychology. The smaller agency didn't win by being stronger. They won by being present at the right balcony on the right night, while the giant was still checking the weather.